The night air was crisp, the kind that gnawed at the skin and left a chill crawling up the spine. Four friends huddled close together as they wandered down the poorly lit road, surrounded by towering trees. At the heart of their curiosity was an elegant invitation, delivered anonymously to each of them earlier that week. The invitation was simple, yet oddly captivating. You are cordially invited to the Halloween party of the century. October 31st, at the Van Buren Mansion, 9 p.m. We're your finest, for this night is eternal. The handwritten text was etched in an old-fashioned script, and the edges of the paper seemed to be worn with age. "What do you think this is all about?" asked Amy, the youngest and most skeptical of the group, her blonde hair catching the moonlight. She fiddled with the hem of her black dress, feeling uneasy about the whole thing. Jake, ever the daredevil, grinned. "It's Halloween. Probably some over-the-top theme party. Rich people love this kind of spooky stuff." His confidence was palpable, though there was something in his voice that suggested even he was a bit unsettled. Beside him, Sarah, Amy's best friend and the one who had insisted on coming, shivered beneath her coat. "I think it sounds exciting. A mansion party, just like in the old movies. I mean, what could go wrong?" And then there was Chris, silent as ever, his face unreadable. He glanced at the others but remained quiet. It wasn't like him to join in on these sorts of adventures, but something about the invitation had drawn him in. As they approached the Van Buren mansion, the wind seemed to pick up, howling through the skeletal branches of the trees. The mansion itself was a sprawling Gothic structure, its towering windows dark and foreboding. Ivy had crept over the stone walls, strangling the architecture like nature's claim on the old relic. It stood alone at the end of a long gravel driveway, distant from any neighboring houses, as though time had forgotten it. "Well, here we are," Jake announced, his voice wavering slightly as they stood at the massive iron gates. They creaked open with a loud groan, as if beckoning them inside. Beyond the gate, the front yard was littered with crumbling statues and a fountain long dried up. The front door loomed large before them, adorned with intricate carvings of masked figures and swirls of ivy. When Jake reached for the knocker, a large brass skull, he hesitated just for a moment, his bravado faltering. Then, with a swift motion, he rapped it against the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as though the house had been waiting for them, the door slowly creaked open. Inside, candlelight flickered faintly, illuminating a grand hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and decaying velvet, and the faint hum of music, jazzy, distant, like something from another era, reached their ears. "Looks like the party started without us," Chris muttered. The group stepped over the threshold, their footsteps muffled by the dusty red carpet beneath them. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. Amy glanced back, her heart skipping a beat, but the door appeared locked, as though the house itself had made the decision for them. "I don't like this," she whispered. "This place feels wrong." Jake, sensing her unease, flashed a smile. "It's all part of the vibe, Ames. It's Halloween, remember?" The hallway opened up into a grand ballroom where the party was in full swing. Guests in elaborate 1920s costumes twirled and laughed, their faces hidden behind masks of gold, black, and white. The room was bathed in an eerie orange glow, as if the very air had been dyed with the color of autumn. A massive chandelier, its crystals dusted with cobwebs, hung precariously above the dance floor. But something was off. The dancers moved in perfect synchrony, their smiles frozen in place, their laughter echoing unnaturally. The music, though lively, had a strange, disjointed quality to it, like a record skipping just slightly off beat. "Okay, this is officially weird," Sarah said, her voice low. "Why is everyone dressed like they're from another time? And look at their faces." Amy took a deep breath, trying to shake off the creeping dread gnawing at her insides. "We need to leave," she urged. But before anyone could respond, a tall figure emerged from the crowd, gliding towards them with an almost ghostly grace. He was dressed in a tuxedo, his dark hair slicked back, and a porcelain mask covered his face. "Welcome to the Van Buren Halloween Gala," he said, his voice cold and formal. "I trust you'll find the evening unforgettable." Before anyone could respond, the doors to the ballroom slammed shut with a deafening bang. The music stopped abruptly, and the guests turned, their masked faces now fixed directly on the newcomers. Amy's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. They weren't just guests at this party. They were prisoners. And the party wasn't going to end. The silence that followed the slamming of the doors was suffocating. Amy's breath caught in her throat, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of explanation. The masked figures surrounding them stood eerily still, like mannequins dressed for a party long forgotten. Then, just as quickly as the music had stopped, it began again, a haunting jazz melody, its tempo unnervingly slow, like the rhythm of a heartbeat sinking into despair. "What the hell is happening?" Chris's voice was barely above a whisper, but the tension in it was unmistakable. He took a step back, his eyes darting from one masked figure to the next, searching for any hint of humanity beneath the porcelain masks. But there was none. The guests continued to sway to the eerie music, their bodies moving in perfect synchrony. Jake's bravado had crumbled. "This isn't a game," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Something's seriously wrong here." The tall man in the tuxedo stepped forward again, his mask tilting as though he was studying their reactions. "You must be tired from your journey," he said, his voice smooth but hollow. "Why don't you join us in a dance?" His suggestion wasn't a question. The moment he spoke, the crowd parted, and a pair of masked dancers glided toward them. Without warning, one of them, a woman with dark curls spilling from beneath her feathered headpiece, reached out and grabbed Amy by the wrist. Her grip was cold, like marble, and uncomfortably strong. Amy gasped, trying to pull away, but the woman's strength was unnatural. "Amy!" Sarah reached for her friend, but another dancer intercepted her, pulling her into the crowd. The room exploded into motion. Every figure on the floor suddenly became animated, swirling around them, their laughter loud and unnerving. Jake was yanked away by a masked man in a top hat, while Chris was forced into a waltz with a woman whose mask resembled a grinning skull. They were no longer guests, they were dancers, unwilling participants in this twisted performance. Amy's heart pounded in her chest as the woman spun her in a slow circle, the music now growing louder and more chaotic. "Let me go!" Amy cried, her voice lost beneath the cacophony. The woman's cold fingers only tightened their grip. As the dancers swirled around her, Amy's vision blurred. She caught glimpses of her friends, all of them being pulled deeper into the crowd. Chris was struggling, trying to break free, but the woman in the skull mask clung to him like a shadow. Sarah, wide-eyed and panicked, was being dragged toward the center of the room by two masked figures. Jake had vanished completely, swallowed up by the sea of bodies. Amy fought against her captor, twisting and turning, her breath ragged as panic set in. She looked into the woman's mask, searching for any sign of emotion, any flicker of humanity, but there was only the cold, unfeeling porcelain. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Amy yanked her arm free and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She turned to run, but the room had shifted. The ballroom seemed to stretch and distort, its walls bending inward, trapping her in a labyrinth of masked faces and ghostly figures. Every door she tried to reach was swallowed by the crowd. The dancers moved faster now, their laughter echoing in her ears, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets being yanked by invisible strings. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear, soft but chilling. "You can't leave, you know." Amy spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one behind her. The voice had come from nowhere, or everywhere. The room seemed alive, whispering to her, closing in around her. She ran, pushing through the crowd, her vision swimming as panic clawed at her mind. She needed to find her friends. She needed to get out of this place. "Amy!" It was Sarah's voice, sharp and filled with terror. Amy turned, spotting her friend across the room. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to shake off the two dancers gripping her arms. Amy sprinted toward her, but the crowd shifted again, a wall of bodies blocking her path. She shoved past them, her breath coming in desperate gasps, but every step forward felt like she was sinking deeper into quicksand. The walls of the ballroom seemed to pulse, the ceiling looming lower, the chandeliers flickering ominously above. In a desperate move, Amy shoved one of the masked dancers out of the way, her shoulder colliding with his chest. The man staggered, but as he turned to face her, something horrifying happened. His mask slipped, just for a second, revealing the face beneath. Amy froze. There was no skin, no human flesh beneath the porcelain. Only a hollow, decayed visage, its eyes black pits of nothingness, its mouth twisted in an eternal scream. The mask snapped back into place, but the image was burned into Amy's mind, an image of pure, inhuman terror. She stumbled backward, her stomach lurching with nausea, but there was no time to process what she'd seen. A pair of hands grabbed her from behind, pulling her back into the fray. This time, the grip was stronger, colder, impossible to escape. "You're part of the dance now," a voice whispered in her ear, a voice that sounded like it had crawled out of the grave. Amy's heart raced as she fought against the invisible force, but the harder she struggled, the tighter the grip became. The room around her spun, the walls closing in, the music growing louder and more frantic. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The music cut off. The dancers froze in place. The room fell into a deep, unnatural silence. Amy, gasping for breath, looked around, her vision blurry and her mind reeling. She was standing in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the still, unmoving figures. Her friends were nowhere to be seen. And then, from the far end of the room, the tall man in the tuxedo stepped forward once again, his porcelain mask gleaming in the dim light. "The dance is over," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "For now." Amy collapsed to her knees, her body trembling. But deep down, she knew the truth. The dance was never over. It would begin again. And again. Forever. Amy's body felt heavy, the weight of the room pressing in on her as if the very air had grown thick and oppressive. She stayed on her knees, her pulse still pounding in her ears, trying to make sense of what just happened. Around her, the masked figures stood frozen in place, their heads slightly tilted as if waiting for some unspoken signal to start moving again. Then, through the oppressive silence, she heard it, a slow, deliberate ticking sound. At first, she thought it was her own heartbeat, but as it grew louder, she realized it was coming from somewhere above her. She looked up at the grand chandelier hanging from the ceiling. It swayed ever so slightly, casting shadows that danced across the walls, almost as if mocking her terror. But there was no clock in the room. Amy's mind raced. Where were her friends? Had they been pulled deeper into this nightmarish mansion? She forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her, and took a hesitant step forward. The masked figures remained still, their cold gazes following her every move. She had to find them. She couldn't be alone in this place. A door creaked open to her left, a thin sliver of dim light spilling into the ballroom. Amy's breath hitched, her body instinctively tensing. It was an invitation, but she wasn't sure from whom or from what. Every instinct told her not to go, not to follow the path laid out for her. But what choice did she have? Staying in the ballroom felt like waiting for death, or something far worse. The ticking grew louder as she crossed the room, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. She glanced at the masked figures one last time, hoping for some sign of humanity, but they remained cold, statuesque. With a deep breath, she stepped through the door. The corridor beyond was narrow, the walls lined with faded portraits. The eyes of the painted figures seemed to follow her, their expressions grim and joyless. The ticking sound reverberated through the hall, louder now, almost as if the walls themselves were counting down to something. Amy shivered, quickening her pace. Sarah? Chris? Jake? Her voice came out weak, her throat tight with fear. The mansion responded with silence, save for the ticking that seemed to be drawing her further into its depths. She passed room after room, each one more decrepit than the last. Dust-coated furniture, torn wallpaper, and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling told the story of a house long forgotten by time, yet somehow still alive. There was a strange electricity in the air, something unseen but undeniably present. She could feel it pressing against her skin, a constant reminder that she was not alone. As Amy reached the end of the hallway, she came to a large wooden door, slightly ajar. The ticking had become unbearably loud now, as if whatever lay beyond was demanding her attention. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a parlor of sorts, lit by the soft glow of a fire in a grand fireplace. Unlike the other rooms, this one seemed meticulously maintained. The furniture, though old-fashioned, looked untouched by the decay of the rest of the mansion. A long dining table stood in the center of the room, set for a feast that had long since gone uneaten. Silverware gleamed, and crystal glasses sparkled in the firelight. But it wasn't the table that caught her attention. Sitting in one of the high-backed chairs at the head of the table was a figure, no mask, no costume, just a man dressed in a sharp 1920s-style suit. His hair was slicked back, and his face, though unnervingly pale, was handsome in a timeless way. He looked up as Amy entered, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth like silk, though there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down Amy's spine. "You're just in time." "For what?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "For the main event. The real dance." Amy's heart raced. She glanced around the room, looking for any sign of her friends. "Where are they? Where are my friends?" The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "They're already part of the party," he said, gesturing toward the shadows behind her. Amy spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just beyond the flickering light of the fire, were Sarah, Chris, and Jake. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Their eyes were vacant, their expressions slack, as if they weren't really there at all. They stood still, their bodies unnaturally stiff, like puppets waiting for their strings to be pulled. "Sarah?" Amy whispered, taking a tentative step toward her friend. But Sarah didn't respond. None of them did. They just stared ahead, their faces pale and lifeless. "They've joined the dance," the man said from behind her. His voice was soft, but there was a cruel amusement in it now. Just like you will. Amy's blood ran cold. I'm not going to stay here. I'm not going to. The man chuckled darkly, cutting her off. You think you have a choice? He stood from his chair, slowly walking toward her. You walked into this house the moment you accepted the invitation. The moment you crossed the threshold, you became part of it. There's no leaving. Amy backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced at her friends again, desperate to wake them, to break whatever spell they were under. But something in the man's voice told her the truth. There was no waking them. They were already lost. You can dance, or you can fade, the man said, his tone almost playful now. But either way, you're staying. Amy's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. She wouldn't. There had to be a way out, some escape from this nightmare. But every instinct screamed that the mansion was a trap, a prison disguised as a party, and she was its latest victim. Without thinking, she bolted for the door, her footsteps thundering down the hallway as she ran. The ticking sound followed her, growing louder and faster, as if the house itself was counting down to something. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. But deep down, she knew the truth. In a place like this, there was no escape. There never had been. The mansion seemed to grow darker with each passing second, as if the very walls were absorbing the light, drinking it in like a starved creature. Amy's pulse quickened as the old grandfather clock in the foyer ticked louder, its steady rhythm pounding in her ears. The eerie silence that followed after Jake's disappearance hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Sarah's grip on Amy's arm was tight, her nails digging into her skin, but Amy couldn't feel anything beyond the chilling fear creeping up her spine. Chris was pacing, muttering to himself, glancing at the other guests like they might leap at him at any moment. The masked figures, standing impossibly still around them, watched with eyes Amy couldn't see. She was certain they were more than just masks now. There was something beneath them, something more sinister than she had imagined. "Where's Jake?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice trembling. Amy wanted to say something, anything, to comfort her, but she couldn't shake the growing dread that Jake was no longer Jake, that the house had already claimed him. She opened her mouth to speak when a soft melody drifted through the air. The phonograph in the corner of the room had sprung to life, playing a haunting tune from the 1920s, the kind of music you'd expect at a speakeasy. But here, it felt wrong. It felt like it was mocking them. "Let's go," Chris said suddenly, snapping them out of their stupor. His voice was firm, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. "We need to leave. Now." Amy nodded, but as they turned towards the front door, something strange happened. The door that had been there moments before now stood fused with the wall, as if it had never been a door at all. A smooth, seamless expanse of wood replaced it, stretching out in front of them like an impenetrable barrier. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, pounding on the wall where the door should have been. His fists hit the wood with a dull thud, but the mansion remained unyielding, as though mocking his efforts. "The house doesn't want us to leave," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit her like a cold wave. This place, this thing, was alive. It wasn't just haunted, it was conscious, and it was playing with them. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the room, followed by the groaning of the floorboards beneath their feet. The ground shifted, warped, and then split open. Amy stumbled backward, grabbing Sarah as the wood beneath them buckled. From the darkness below, she could hear something slithering, moving just beyond sight. A deep, guttural sound echoed from the depths, like the mansion was waking up, like it had been waiting for them. "We need to get out of here." Sarah screamed, her panic finally overtaking her as she tried to pull Amy towards the staircase. But the stairs, too, seemed to shift, elongating and twisting like the limbs of a grotesque creature, making the distance between them and safety feel impossibly far. Amy's breath quickened. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, hammering like a drum, the air around her thickening with each second. The walls seemed to pulsate, moving in rhythm with the music, as though the mansion itself was feeding off their fear. Chris bolted towards the window, his last-ditch attempt at escape. He grabbed a chair, hurling it with all his strength, but the glass didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. Instead, the window seemed to ripple like water, absorbing the impact, mocking his efforts. "It's not real," Amy muttered, her mind racing. She could feel the truth clawing at the edges of her consciousness. None of this is real. The house, it's messing with us. But Sarah was beyond reason now, her fear giving way to hysteria. She pulled away from Amy and ran, sprinting blindly through the maze of rooms, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the endless halls. "Sarah! Wait!" Amy screamed, chasing after her. She lost sight of Sarah almost immediately, the mansion shifting and warping around her, leading her down unfamiliar corridors. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her, the air thick with the scent of rot. Doors appeared and disappeared before her eyes, each one leading nowhere, a labyrinth of nightmares designed to trap her. The more Amy ran, the more the truth sank in. They were no longer in control. The house had taken over, bending time and space, twisting reality itself. This wasn't just a haunted mansion, it was a living, breathing entity, and they were nothing more than prey. And then, from deep within the mansion, Amy heard a voice. "Join us." It was a whisper, soft and seductive, carried on the wind like a siren song. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, every muscle in her body frozen with terror. The shadows around her began to move, swirling and stretching until they formed dark, twisted figures, their faces obscured by the same eerie masks as the partygoers downstairs. But now, she could see something beneath those masks, something inhuman, something ancient and hungry. She backed away slowly, her breath shallow and ragged. There was no way out. They were trapped. The mansion had them now, and it wasn't going to let them go. But as the darkness closed in, Amy's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to become one of them, not without a fight. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any clue, any weakness in the mansion's twisted game. But the mansion was patient. It knew she would give in eventually. They all did. Amy stood alone in the middle of the hallway, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The mansion seemed to grow heavier, darker with each passing moment. It felt alive, watching her, savoring her fear. Somewhere in the distance, she could still hear the faint strains of jazz music drifting through the walls, as though the party downstairs continued, indifferent to the horror unfolding above. She thought of Sarah, her scream echoing in the back of her mind. Sarah had run blindly into the house, and now she was out there, lost in the shifting maze of rooms. Or worse, already part of the house. Amy's hands trembled as she clutched the railing of the staircase, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She wasn't a superstitious person. She always prided herself on being rational, grounded. But nothing about this was rational. The house was warping reality, bending it in ways she couldn't explain. And then there were the ghosts. The thought made her stomach churn. Could it be true? Could those partygoers downstairs really be the spirits of people who'd been trapped here for nearly a century? She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just spirits, though. They were more than that. They were part of the house, woven into its very fabric, feeding off the souls of anyone unlucky enough to step inside. Amy pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to dwell on it, not now. She needed to find Sarah, and she needed to find a way out. But the mansion had other plans. The floor beneath her feet creaked and groaned, and the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. She took a step forward, and the hallway stretched before her, elongating impossibly, like she was looking down the wrong end of a telescope. Doors on either side of her appeared and disappeared, the walls shifting and pulsing, as if the house were breathing around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to move. She had to keep going, had to find her friends, had to. A door slammed shut somewhere behind her. Amy froze. The sound echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the walls. She turned slowly, her pulse quickening. The door was just a few feet behind her now, though she was sure it had been farther back just moments ago. She stared at it, waiting, listening. Nothing. She took a step toward it, her heart hammering in her throat. Another step. The wood of the floor creaked beneath her weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the suffocating silence. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. The door burst open, and a figure lunged at her from the darkness. Amy screamed and stumbled back, falling hard onto the floor. Her head hit the wood with a dull thud, and for a moment, the world spun. She blinked, dazed, as a shape loomed over her, a man in an old-fashioned tuxedo, his eyes wide and empty behind a porcelain mask. The mask itself was cracked, revealing patches of decayed flesh beneath. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the polished floor as the man advanced, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. He reached for her, his fingers clawing at the air, and she felt a coldness radiating from him, a chill that seeped into her bones. "No," she cried, her voice cracking with terror. "Stay away." But the man didn't stop. His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and a faint whisper escaped from behind the mask. "Join us." Amy's back hit the wall, and she realized with a jolt that there was nowhere to run. The man was only inches away now, his decaying hand reaching out for her, the smell of rot filling the air. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the icy touch of his fingers. But it never came. When she opened her eyes, the hallway was empty. The man was gone. Amy's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to her feet. Her legs felt weak, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She didn't know how much more of this she could take. The house was playing with her, toying with her fear, and she could feel herself unraveling with each passing second. The thought of Jake, Chris, and Sarah haunted her. Were they experiencing the same thing? Had the house already claimed them? The image of Sarah's terrified face flashed in her mind, and she swallowed the rising panic. She couldn't let it consume her. Not yet. She glanced around the hallway, half expecting the man to reappear, but the corridor was still. The silence was oppressive, but at least it wasn't broken by the crackling of old jazz or the creak of shifting floorboards. She needed to think, needed to find her way out before the house could trap her like it had those ghosts downstairs. As she turned to continue down the hall, a small flicker of light caught her eye. At the end of the hallway, barely visible, was a faint glow, a single, dim light coming from behind another door. It was the only hint of life in the otherwise dark, twisting mansion. With no other choice, Amy moved toward it. The door was slightly ajar, and as she approached, she heard something faint, voices. They were whispering, murmuring just out of reach, as though they were speaking directly into her thoughts. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything in her screamed to turn back, to run the other way. But something else, something she couldn't explain, pulled her forward. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside was a small room, dimly lit by a single candle sitting atop an old wooden table. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white images of people dressed in 1920s attire, smiling, laughing, dancing. In the center of the room was a large mirror, its surface dusty and cracked, reflecting the dim light in a strange, distorted way. Amy stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The voices were louder now, filling the room, though she couldn't understand what they were saying. They sounded like echoes, like the remnants of conversations long forgotten. She turned to leave, but something in the mirror caught her eye. She froze. In the reflection, standing just behind her, was Sarah. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide with terror. But when Amy turned to face her, the room was empty. Sarah was gone. Amy's stomach twisted in knots as the truth finally settled in. The house wasn't just toying with them. It was claiming them, one by one, turning them into part of its endless nightmare. And if she didn't find a way out soon, she would be next. Amy's heart raced as she stumbled out of the room, her mind struggling to process what she had seen. Sarah, her best friend, reduced to a ghostly reflection, trapped somewhere beyond the veil of this cursed house. The realization chilled her to the core. The mansion was feeding on them, turning them into its own twisted inhabitants. And if she didn't escape soon, she would suffer the same fate. The hallway twisted before her, growing darker, the walls closing in. Every step she took seemed to stretch the distance between her and any hope of freedom. The house was shifting again, warping the space around her, bending reality to its will. As she moved down the corridor, she could hear the music growing louder, the faint, eerie strains of jazz wafting through the walls like the laughter of the dead. It was coming from below, from the grand ballroom where the endless Halloween party carried on, year after year. It seemed to pulse through the floorboards beneath her feet, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. Amy's thoughts raced as she reached the top of the grand staircase. She could see the ballroom below, glowing with an otherworldly light. The guests were still there, still dancing, still trapped in their eternal celebration. The scene might have been beautiful once, but now it was grotesque, a macabre tableau of the dead, their faces frozen in time, their hollow eyes staring into nothingness. She knew she had to get out. But the front door was impossibly far away, and the house seemed to be alive, waiting for her to make a wrong move. And then she saw him. Standing at the base of the stairs, bathed in the soft glow of the chandelier, was Jake. He looked up at her, his face pale but calm, as if none of this was real, as if everything was still normal. But something was wrong. His eyes were too vacant, too distant, like the eyes of the guests at the party. "Jake?" Amy whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. She wanted to run to him, to shake him out of whatever trance had taken hold, but her feet refused to move. He smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Amy, you should join us," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "The party's just beginning." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." Jake took a step forward, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "You don't understand," he said. "There is no leaving. This is the only place that matters now. We're part of it, Amy. You can't fight it." Amy backed away, her hands gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I'm not staying here," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm getting out." His smile faded, replaced by something darker, something cold and empty. "You can't leave," he said. "None of us can. Amy turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the hollow halls as she sprinted down the corridor. The mansion groaned around her, the walls shifting and creaking as if the house itself was closing in on her. Doors slammed shut on either side, the air growing thick and heavy. She could hear footsteps behind her, Jake's, or something pretending to be Jake, following her, relentless, unyielding. The echo of his voice chased her through the corridors. "You belong here, Amy. You belong to the house." Panic gripped her as she reached the end of the hallway, only to find another door waiting for her. It was different from the others, an old, heavy wooden door with intricate carvings. Something about it felt final. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the knob. Then, with a deep breath, she flung the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit by a single candle on a table, much like the one she had seen earlier. But this time, there were no mirrors, no photographs, only a large, open window that looked out into the night. For the first time since entering the mansion, she saw the outside world, the trees swaying in the wind, the stars twinkling in the sky. Freedom! Amy rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cool night air on her skin, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that she could escape. But when she reached the window and looked down, her heart sank. There was no ground below. Just an endless void, stretching out into darkness. The house wasn't going to let her leave. Not like this. Her legs wobbled, and she stumbled back, her mind reeling. The music was louder now, pounding in her ears, and she realized with growing horror that the voices were back. The whispers. They were calling to her, drawing her closer. "Amy." She turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Sarah. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, more figures appeared, Jake, Chris, and others she didn't recognize. The partygoers, the ghosts. They filled the room, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "It's time, Amy," Sarah said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "You have to join us." "No," Amy whispered, backing away. I won't stay here." But deep down, she knew the truth. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. There was no escape. The party would continue, and she would become one of them, another soul trapped in the eternal Halloween. The candle flickered, and the music swelled, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. The walls seemed to close in around her, the faces of the ghosts growing darker, their smiles more twisted. Amy took one last step toward the window, but her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. The room spun, and she could feel the cold fingers of the ghosts reaching for her, pulling her into the dark, endless night of the mansion. And as the world faded to black, the last thing Amy heard was the voice of the house, whispering its final invitation. "Welcome home."